My name is Rebecca Thompson. I am 41 years old. I am a brigadier general in the United States Army. But to my family, none of that has ever mattered. To them, I was always the black sheep, the daughter who made the wrong choices, the one who abandoned everything they held sacred. I was the disappointment they whispered about behind closed doors, the failure they pretended didn't exist. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Standing in the December cold outside St. Michael's Cathedral, watching through frosted windows as my own family gathered to mourn my grandmother without me, I felt the familiar sting of rejection. 23 years of military service, countless missions, lives saved, and still, I wasn't welcome, I wasn't family. Not to them. But they had no idea who I really was, no idea what I had accomplished, no idea that in exactly 17 minutes, everything they thought they knew about their failed daughter would shatter like ice under summer sun. The rejection started early, so early I sometimes wonder if I was born into it. Growing up in the sprawling suburbs of Richmond, Virginia, in a house that looked perfect from the outside, white columns, manicured lawn, the kind of place that screamed respectability, I learned quickly that appearances mattered more than truth. My father, Richard Thompson, was a successful corporate lawyer who measured worth in billable hours and social standing. My mother, Patricia, devoted her life to charity galas and book clubs, crafting an image of refined Southern grace. They had built their world on expectations, traditions, and the unspoken rule that children should reflect their parents' values without question. Then there was my older brother, David, the golden son who could do no wrong. Valedictorian, Harvard Law School, married to a senator's daughter, he was everything they had dreamed of in a child. Perfect, polished, predictable. And then there was me. From the moment I could walk, I was different. While David practiced piano and attended etiquette lessons, I climbed trees and collected beetles. While he excelled in debate club, I spent my afternoons at the local YMCA, learning self-defense from a retired Marine sergeant named Frank Williams. He was the first person who ever told me I was strong, that my stubbornness could be an asset rather than a character flaw. My parents tolerated my oddities when I was young, dismissing them as phases I would outgrow. But as I entered my teenage years and showed no signs of conforming to their vision of proper Southern womanhood, the disappointment became palpable. I remember the exact moment things shifted irreversibly. I was 16, sitting in our formal dining room with its crystal chandelier and oil paintings of long-dead relatives. The conversation had turned to college plans, as it often did during my junior year. David was already established at Harvard, making law reviews and dating the right people. Rebecca will attend Sweetbriar College, my mother announced, as if my future had been decided without my input. They have an excellent liberal arts program, and she'll meet the right sort of people. I set down my fork carefully, the way I'd been taught, and looked directly at my father. I'm thinking about the military academies, actually. West Point, or the Air Force Academy. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's face went pale, her hand fluttering to her pearl necklace, a nervous gesture I'd witnessed countless times. My father's jaw tightened, that familiar vein appearing at his temple. "Don't be ridiculous, Rebecca," he said finally, his voice controlled but cold. "Thompson women don't join the military. We have a reputation to maintain." "A reputation built on what?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Hiding behind other people's sacrifices, while pretending we're somehow above service." The explosion that followed wasn't loud. My parents were too refined for shouting. Instead, it was the quiet, devastating kind of anger that cuts deeper than any raised voice. Words like ungrateful, selfish, and disgrace were spoken in measured tones that somehow made them sting more. That night, lying in my four-poster bed surrounded by the pink and gold decor my mother had chosen without consulting me, I made a decision. I would prove them wrong, not by becoming what they wanted, but by becoming someone I could respect. The next 2 years were a careful dance of maintaining the peace while secretly preparing for my escape. I kept my grades high, participated in the social events they deemed important, and smiled politely when they introduced me to suitable young men at country club gatherings. But in my spare time, I was training, studying, pushing my body and mind to meet the standards I'd need for military service. Frank Williams became my unofficial mentor, helping me prepare physically and mentally for what lay ahead. He never asked why a girl from Richmond's elite was so determined to join the military. He simply helped me become strong enough to survive it. The morning I left for West Point, there was no tearful goodbye, no proud send-off. My parents had made their position clear. I was making a mistake that would bring shame to the family name. My mother couldn't even look at me as I loaded my single duffel bag into the taxi. My father handed me an envelope without a word, not a letter of encouragement, but legal documents removing me from certain family trusts, making their disappointment official. David wasn't there at all. He was in Europe on his honeymoon, married to the Charleston aristocracy in a wedding that had cost more than most people's houses. I hadn't been asked to be in the wedding party. Apparently, my military aspirations made me unsuitable for the photographs. As the taxi pulled away from the house where I'd spent 18 years feeling like a stranger, I didn't look back. I was finally free to become whoever I was meant to be, even if it meant doing it completely alone. West Point was everything I had hoped for, and nothing I had expected. The discipline was brutal, the academic demands relentless, and the physical training pushed me beyond every limit I thought I had. But for the first time in my life, I was being judged on my performance, not my adherence to social expectations. I wasn't the strongest cadet in my class, or the fastest, but I was determined. When others complained about the early morning runs, I ran harder. When they groaned about the endless inspections, I made sure my uniform was perfect. When they called home to complain to sympathetic parents, I used that time to study. My phone never rang. My mailbox remained empty, except for official academy correspondence. While other cadets received care packages and letters of encouragement, I learned to find motivation in solitude. The isolation should have broken me, but instead, it forged me into something harder, more resilient. I discovered that I didn't need their approval to succeed. In fact, their absence made me more focused, more driven to prove that their assessment of me had been catastrophically wrong. During my junior year, I sent them a photograph of myself in dress uniform at a formal military ball, hoping that seeing me in my element might soften their stance. The picture came back unopened, returned to sender written in my mother's careful script across the envelope. That was the last time I tried to reach out. I graduated 4th in my class, commissioned as a second lieutenant, and began my career as an officer in the United States Army. I sent no announcements, made no calls. If they wanted to pretend I didn't exist, I would give them exactly what they wanted, but I would remember every slight, every dismissal, every moment they made me feel like I wasn't good enough. I would carry it with me, not as a burden, but as fuel, because someday, somehow, they would see exactly who their failed daughter had become, and when that day came, I would be ready. The years that followed my graduation from West Point were a whirlwind of assignments, deployments, and steady advancement through the ranks. My first posting was Fort Benning, Georgia, where I served as a platoon leader in the 3rd Infantry Division. The red clay and humid summers reminded me of home in ways that were both comforting and painful. I threw myself into my work with the intensity of someone who had nothing else to lose. While other young officers struggled to balance their personal lives with military demands, I had the advantage of singular focus. There were no weekend visits home, no family obligations, no distractions from the mission at hand. My soldiers respected me, not because of where I came from, but because of who I was in the field. I learned their names, their stories, their fears. I pushed them hard but fairly, and when the chips were down, I was right there beside them. In the Army, authenticity mattered more than pedigree, a lesson my family never understood. 3 years into my service, I received orders for my first deployment to Afghanistan. It was 2006, and the war was entering a particularly volatile phase. As I prepared to leave, I found myself wondering if my family even knew I was about to deploy to a combat zone. The thought arrived unbidden, and left just as quickly. I had learned not to dwell on questions that had no answers. Afghanistan changed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. The stark beauty of the mountains, the complexity of the conflict, the weight of making decisions that could mean life or death for the people under my command. it all crystallized something inside me. This was where I belonged. Not in drawing rooms discussing charity events, but here, where every choice mattered and competence was measured in lives saved rather than social connections. During my second tour, while leading a convoy security mission near Kandahar, we encountered an improvised explosive device that destroyed the lead vehicle and wounded 4 soldiers. Under heavy enemy fire, I coordinated the medical evacuation while directing our defensive response. For 6 hours, we held our position until reinforcements arrived, ensuring that every wounded soldier made it home alive. For that action, I was awarded the Bronze Star with Valor device. I remember holding the medal box in my small quarters that night, thinking about how proud Frank Williams would have been. He had passed away 2 years earlier, and his funeral was the only one I had attended since leaving home. His family, people who barely knew me, had welcomed me with open arms, grateful for the role I'd played in his final years. I wondered if my own family had even noticed his obituary in the Richmond Times-Dispatch, or if they remembered the countless hours he'd spent preparing their daughter for a life they couldn't understand. The promotions came steadily: first lieutenant, captain, major. With each advancement, I sent a brief notification to the family home, not because I expected a response, but because some part of me still believed in doing the right thing, even when it wasn't reciprocated. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The letters always came back marked return to sender, but I kept sending them anyway. It became a ritual of sorts, a way of maintaining my own integrity, even in the face of their rejection. By the time I made lieutenant colonel, I had served in 3 combat deployments and earned a reputation as an officer who could handle the most challenging assignments. My personnel file was thick with commendations, performance evaluations that consistently rated me in the top 1%, and recommendations for command positions that reflected the trust my superiors placed in my judgment. I was stationed at the Pentagon when I learned that my grandmother, Eleanor Thompson, was gravely ill. The information came not from family, but from a Google alert I had set up years earlier to monitor local Richmond news. The brief article mentioned that the matriarch of the prominent Thompson family was in hospice care. For 3 days I debated whether to reach out. My grandmother had been different from my parents, quieter, less concerned with appearances, more interested in who people were rather than what they represented. She had been the one person in the family who seemed to understand my restlessness, even if she couldn't openly support my choices. I remembered summer afternoons spent in her garden, listening to stories about her own father, who had served in World War II. She never criticized my military interests the way my parents did, though she never encouraged them either. She simply listened, which in that family was revolutionary in itself. Finally, I called the hospital. When I identified myself as Eleanor Thompson's granddaughter, there was a long pause before the nurse said, "I'm sorry, but Mrs. Thompson has specifically requested no visitors except for immediate family members on an approved list." I wasn't on the list, even dying. Even at the very end, the family barriers held firm. 3 weeks later, Eleanor Thompson passed away peacefully in her sleep. I learned about it the same way I learned about everything else related to my family, through the local newspaper's online obituary section. The obituary was everything I expected: lengthy, detailed, full of social accomplishments and charitable contributions. It listed her survivors with careful precision: her son Richard and his wife Patricia, her grandson David and his wife Catherine, and their children. There was no mention of another granddaughter. In the carefully crafted narrative of her life, I simply didn't exist. The funeral was scheduled for the following Saturday at St. Michael's Cathedral, the same church where my parents had been married, where David had been confirmed, where all the significant Thompson family events had taken place. I had never set foot inside it as a family member. I had been away at West Point during David's wedding, and had been deliberately excluded from every other family gathering since. I should have stayed away. Logic dictated that I respect their wishes, maintain the distance they had so carefully constructed, but something deeper than logic was at work. My grandmother had been the one person who might have understood the woman I had become, and I needed to say goodbye, even if it meant doing so from the outside looking in. The night before the funeral, I pressed my dress uniform with the same attention to detail I brought to every military ceremony. I polished my insignia until it gleamed, arranged my ribbons with mathematical precision. If I was going to be excluded, I would at least be excluded with dignity. I had no idea that decision would change everything. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp December air that cuts through even the heaviest coat. I had driven the 3 hours from Washington, D.C. to Richmond before dawn, giving myself time to prepare mentally for what was to come. The city looked exactly as I remembered it: historic brick buildings, tree-lined streets, the comfortable prosperity that came from old money and older traditions. Michael's Cathedral stood imposing against the gray sky, its Gothic spires reaching toward heaven like stone prayers. Cars were already arriving, black sedans and luxury SUVs discharging passengers dressed in expensive morning attire. I recognized some faces from my childhood: family friends, business associates, the same social circle that had always defined my parents' world. I parked across the street, positioned where I could see the entrance but remained unobtrusive. Through my windshield, I watched my family arrive like actors taking their places for a performance they had rehearsed their entire lives. My father emerged from a silver Mercedes, his hair now completely gray, but his posture still commanding. He wore his grief like he wore everything else, carefully, appropriately, with an awareness of how it appeared to others. My mother walked beside him, elegant in black Chanel, her movements precise and controlled even in sorrow. David came next, his wife Catherine on his arm. She was every inch the senator's daughter my parents had always wanted in the family: blonde, polished, politically connected. Their twin daughters, now 8 years old, walked behind them in matching navy dresses. I stared at my nieces, realizing I had never seen them except in newspaper photos from society events. They didn't know I existed. The sight of them hit me harder than I had expected. Those little girls carried my blood, shared my family history, and yet I was as much a stranger to them as any random person on the street. My parents had successfully erased me so completely that their own grandchildren had grown up believing they only had one aunt. David's wife's sister, who lived in Charleston and sent elaborate birthday presents. I waited until the family had entered the cathedral before crossing the street. The heavy wooden doors were propped open, and I could hear the soft murmur of voices, the rustle of programs, the muffled sobs of genuine mourners. But as I approached the entrance, a figure stepped into my path. "Excuse me, miss." The voice belonged to James Morton, my father's longtime law partner and family friend. He had aged since I last saw him, but his eyes still held the same calculating look I remembered from childhood dinner parties. "I'm afraid this is a private service. I'm family," I said quietly, meeting his gaze without flinching. His expression shifted slightly, recognition flickering across his features. "Rebecca, I didn't expect to see you here. I didn't expect to be turned away at my own grandmother's funeral." James shifted uncomfortably, glancing back toward the cathedral doors. "Your parents, they specifically requested. That is to say, they felt it would be better if I weren't here," I finished for him. "I understand, but I didn't move. I stood there in my dress uniform, my ribbons catching the weak winter sunlight, and waited." James looked uncertain, caught between his loyalty to my parents and the awkwardness of the situation. Behind him, I could see other family friends watching curiously. "Rebecca," my father's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. He had emerged from the cathedral, no doubt having been informed of my presence. He approached with measured steps, his face a mask of controlled displeasure. "What are you doing here?" "Paying my respects to grandmother. She wouldn't have wanted you here." The words were delivered with surgical precision, designed to inflict maximum damage. "You made your choice 23 years ago when you abandoned this family. You don't get to show up now and pretend to be something you're not." A small crowd had gathered: relatives, friends, people who remembered me as the rebellious teenager who had brought shame to the Thompson name. I could feel their eyes, hear their whispered conversations. Some looked curious, others disapproving, a few seemed almost sympathetic. "And what am I pretending to be?" I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "A Thompson." My mother had joined us, her face pale but determined. "You forfeited that right when you chose the military over your family. I chose service over selfishness. You chose embarrassment over duty," my father countered. "Do you have any idea what we've had to endure? The questions, the explanations, The constant reminders that our daughter threw away everything we gave her to play soldier. The phrase play soldier hit like a physical blow. I thought of the IED blast in Kandahar, of holding pressure on Sergeant Martinez's shattered leg while calling for medevac under fire. I thought of the Bronze Star in my apartment, awarded for actions that saved 4 lives. I thought of the sleepless nights in forward operating bases, the weight of command, the letters I had written to the families of soldiers who didn't make it home. Play soldier, I repeated softly. Yes, my mother said, stepping closer. This fantasy of yours, this need to prove something to people who don't matter. It's time to grow up, Rebecca. It's time to come home and be who you're supposed to be. David appeared on my parents' shoulders, his expression a mixture of irritation and embarrassment. You're causing a scene, he hissed. On today of all days, can't you show some respect? I looked at him, my brother, the person who should have known me better than anyone, and saw only a stranger. A successful stranger, but a stranger nonetheless. Respect, I said, letting the word hang in the cold air. You want to talk about respect? We want you to leave, my father said firmly. Now, before you make this worse than it already is. The crowd around us had grown larger. I could see people straining to hear, phones being discreetly positioned to capture what had clearly become a family drama worth documenting. In a few hours, this confrontation would probably be all over Richmond's social media, dissected and analyzed by people who had nothing better to do than gossip about other people's pain. I should have walked away. The smart thing, the dignified thing, would have been to turn around and drive back to Washington. But something my grandmother had once told me echoed in my mind. Something I had forgotten until this moment. I was 12 years old, sitting in her garden after a particularly brutal family dinner, where I had been criticized for everything from my posture to my choice of books. She had found me crying behind the rose bushes, and sat down beside me on the stone bench. Rebecca, she had said gently, sometimes the people who love you the most are the least equipped to understand who you're meant to become. But that doesn't mean you should stop becoming her. Standing there outside the cathedral, surrounded by people who had written me off decades ago, I realized something profound. I didn't need their permission to grieve. I didn't need their approval to exist, and I certainly didn't need their understanding to know my own worth. You're right, I said finally, my voice carrying clearly in the crisp air. I should leave, not because you're asking me to, but because I have better things to do than beg for acceptance from people who never deserve to give it. I turned to go, but my father's voice stopped me. That's right, walk away, just like you always do, just like you did when you were 18. I paused, my back to them, and felt something shift inside me. When I turned around, my expression was calm, almost serene. I didn't walk away when I was 18, I said quietly. I was pushed. There's a difference. And then I walked to my car, started the engine, and drove away from them for what I believed would be the final time. I had no idea that in less than 20 minutes, everything would change. I hadn't driven more than 2 blocks when I heard it, the rhythmic sound that every military person recognizes instantly, the synchronized cadence of marching feet on pavement, precise and unmistakable. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I slowed the car, rolling down my window to listen more carefully. The sound was getting closer, coming from the direction of the cathedral. I pulled over to the side of Monroe Street and stepped out of my car, my heart beginning to race for reasons I couldn't yet understand. In the distance, I could see a formation moving down the tree-lined avenue with military precision. 8 soldiers in full dress uniform were marching in perfect formation toward St. Michael's Cathedral. Even from several blocks away, I could see the distinctive blue of army dress uniforms, the glint of polished brass, the measured discipline that spoke of elite training. But this wasn't just any unit. As they drew closer, I could make out the distinctive insignia and bearing that marked them as members of the Old Guard, the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment. The Old Guard, the Army's official ceremonial unit and escort to the President. They provided honor guards for Arlington National Cemetery, conducted military funeral honors for fallen soldiers, and served in some of the most prestigious ceremonial functions in the military. What were they doing in Richmond? And why were they marching toward my grandmother's funeral? I got back in my car and followed at a distance, my mind racing through possibilities. Had there been some mistake, some confusion about the location? The Old Guard didn't just show up randomly. Their missions were planned weeks in advance, coordinated through multiple levels of command. As they approached the cathedral, I could see the crowd of mourners beginning to notice the unusual sight. People were stepping out of the church, pointing, whispering among themselves. My family was nowhere to be seen. They were presumably still inside, unaware of what was developing outside. The formation halted with crisp precision, exactly in front of the cathedral steps. The 8 soldiers stood at attention, their bearing flawless, their uniforms immaculate. At their head stood a figure I recognized, though it took me a moment to process what I was seeing. Command Sergeant Major William Hayes, one of the most senior non-commissioned officers in the entire United States Army. I had worked with him briefly during a Pentagon assignment 2 years earlier, but only in passing. He was legendary in military circles, a soldier's soldier who had served in every major conflict of the past 3 decades. What was he doing here? Behind him stood 7 other soldiers, their chests adorned with ribbons that told stories of service in Iraq, Afghanistan, and conflicts most civilians never heard about. These weren't ceremonial soldiers playing dress-up. These were combat veterans who had earned their place in the old guard through exceptional service and sacrifice. I parked across the street again, this time with a clear view of what was unfolding. My hands were shaking slightly, though I couldn't say why. Something was happening here. Something I didn't understand but that felt monumentally important. Command Sergeant Major Hayes stepped forward and spoke to James Morton, who had emerged from the cathedral looking confused and slightly panicked. I couldn't hear the conversation from my position, but I could see James nodding, gesturing toward the church, clearly explaining that this was a private family service. Hayes listened politely, then said something that made James's expression change completely. The family friend looked shocked, then worried, then began gesturing more frantically. Other people were gathering, funeral guests, passers-by, even some local photographers, who had been covering the service for the society pages. My father appeared at the cathedral entrance, his face a mask of controlled irritation. He clearly viewed this military presence as some sort of disruption to his carefully orchestrated farewell to his mother. I watched him approach Hayes with the same authoritative bearing he used in boardrooms, the assumption that his social position would automatically command respect. The conversation was brief. Hayes said something. My father responded with what appeared to be dismissive gestures, and then Hayes said something else that made my father take a step backward. The change in my father's demeanor was visible even from my distance, the confident authority replaced by uncertainty, the commanding presence diminished. My mother and David had joined them now, along with Catherine and several other family members. They formed a small cluster around Hayes, their body language shifting from annoyed confusion to something approaching alarm. Hayes was explaining something, his military bearing never wavering, his voice calm and professional. And then Hayes did something that made my blood run cold. He pulled out a folder and handed it to my father. Even from across the street, I could see my father's hands trembling as he opened it and began to read. His face went white, completely white. He looked up at Hayes, said something urgently, then looked back down at the papers. My mother leaned over to read whatever was in the folder, and her reaction was even more dramatic. She actually stumbled backward, her hand flying to her throat. David steadied her, then read the documents himself, his own face draining of color. The crowd around them was growing larger, sensing that something significant was happening. Local news photographers were positioning themselves for better angles. Members of Richmond's social elite who had come to pay their respects to Eleanor Thompson were instead witnessing what appeared to be some sort of military intervention. Hayes spoke again, this time loud enough that his voice carried across the street. Though I couldn't make out individual words, his tone was formal, official, the kind of voice used for important announcements. He gestured toward the cathedral, then toward his soldiers, then said something that made several people in the crowd gasp audibly. My father looked around desperately, his eyes scanning the crowd, the street, the nearby buildings. For a moment his gaze landed on my car, but he was too far away to see me clearly. He turned back to Hayes and said something that sounded like a question, urgent and pleading. Hayes nodded once, then turned and called out a command to his soldiers. They immediately shifted formation, creating a clear pathway leading from the street to the cathedral entrance. The precision was breathtaking. 8 highly trained soldiers moving as one, their movements choreographed with the kind of discipline that comes from years of practice. And then Hayes did something that made my heart stop completely. He looked directly across the street, directly at my car, and saluted. Not a casual gesture, not a wave, but a full military salute held with perfect form. The kind of salute reserved for superior officers, for ceremonies of the highest importance, for moments that matter. He was saluting me. The realization hit like a physical blow. Somehow, some way, this had all been arranged for me. The old guard, the honor formation, the official documents that had terrified my family, it was all connected to me. But how, and why? I sat frozen in my car, my mind struggling to process what was happening. Around the cathedral, the crowd was buzzing with excitement and confusion. My family stood in a tight cluster, their faces pale, their earlier confidence completely shattered. And 8 of the army's most elite soldiers waited in perfect formation, as if preparing for a ceremony that no one, except apparently them, had seen coming. Hayes lowered his salute and called out across the street, his voice carrying with military precision, "General Thompson, would you please join us, General Thompson?" He had called me General Thompson, but I wasn't a general. I was a lieutenant colonel, still several ranks away from that level of command. Unless something had happened that I didn't know about. Something that would explain why the old guard was here, why my family looked terrified, and why I was being summoned with a title I had never earned. With trembling hands, I turned off my car and stepped onto the street. Whatever was about to happen, there was no avoiding it now. Walking across that street felt like crossing a bridge between two different worlds. With each step, I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes watching me, the whispered conversations of people trying to understand what they were witnessing. The December air seemed to grow thicker, charged with an energy I couldn't quite name. As I approached the formation, Command Sergeant Major Hayes stepped forward to meet me halfway. His expression was serious but respectful, the kind of look reserved for moments of profound importance. Behind him, the 7 other soldiers maintained their perfect formation, their discipline unwavering despite the growing crowd of onlookers. "Ma'am," Hayes said quietly as I reached him, "I apologize for the dramatic nature of this, but there were specific instructions that this be handled with full military honors." "Instructions from whom?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "And why did you call me General?" Hayes glanced briefly at my family, who stood clustered near the cathedral entrance looking like they had seen a ghost. My father still clutched the folder Hayes had given him, his knuckles white against the manila paper. "Ma'am, perhaps we should step somewhere more private for this conversation," Hayes suggested. But before I could respond, my father's voice cut through the cold air. "No," the word came out strangled, desperate. "Not here, not like this." All eyes turned to him. Richard Thompson, the man who had commanded boardrooms and social gatherings for decades, stood trembling on the steps of the cathedral, where he had once walked with such confidence. His carefully maintained composure was cracking, revealing something underneath that looked suspiciously like fear. "Sir," Hayes addressed my father with professional courtesy, "with respect, this matter is no longer within your authority to control." "What matters?" I demanded, looking between Hayes and my father. "Someone needs to tell me what's happening here." Hayes reached into his dress uniform and withdrew an official envelope sealed with government markings I recognized. "Ma'am, 3 days ago, the Department of Defense received notification of a promotion that was approved at the highest levels of command. Due to the classified nature of operations you've been involved in over the past 18 months, this promotion was processed through special channels." My hands shook as I took the envelope. The seal was real, the weight of the paper substantial. These weren't photocopies or informal notifications. This was official military correspondence of the highest order. "Operations I've been involved in?" I repeated, confused. "I've been stationed at the Pentagon for the past 2 years doing strategic planning. I haven't been in the field." Hayes's expression didn't change, but I caught something in his eyes, a flicker of understanding that suggested he knew far more than I did about my own career. "Ma'am, with respect, there are aspects of your service record that are classified above my clearance level. What I can tell you is that your contributions to Operation Silent Thunder have been deemed exceptional by the Joint Chiefs of Staff." Operation Silent Thunder. I had never heard that designation before, but as Hayes spoke the words, fragments of memory began clicking into place. The late-night briefings I had attended but never fully understood the scope of. The strategic assessments I had written disappeared into classified channels. The humanitarian mission planning that seemed to have implications far beyond what I was told. I had assumed I was just another staff officer pushing papers in the Pentagon. Apparently, I had been wrong. "What rank?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Brigadier General, ma'am." Effective immediately, the words hit me like a physical blow. Brigadier General, not just a promotion, but a leap that typically took years to achieve. The kind of advancement that came only with exceptional circumstances or extraordinary service. The crowd around us had grown larger, and I could see people recording with their phones, whispering among themselves, trying to piece together what they were witnessing. This was no longer a private family matter. It was becoming a public spectacle. "The promotion comes with a new assignment," Hayes continued. "Command of the Joint Task Force for Humanitarian Operations, based out of Fort Bragg. You're to report for duty Monday morning." I stared at him, trying to process not just the words but their implications. A task force command. At the rank of Brigadier General, with responsibilities I could only imagine. "Ma'am," one of the soldiers behind Hayes called out. "If I may." Hayes nodded, and the soldier stepped forward. His name tape read Rodriguez, and his chest was covered with ribbons that told a story of multiple combat deployments. "General Thompson," Rodriguez said, and hearing that title applied to me sent a chill down my spine. "I served under your operational planning in Afghanistan during the Mercy mission evacuation. 347 civilians extracted safely because of strategies you developed. My daughter was born 3 weeks after I got home from that mission." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I requested to be part of this honor guard because I wanted to personally thank the officer who made sure I lived to see her first steps." Another soldier stepped forward. "Sergeant First Class Martinez, ma'am. Your logistics planning for Operation Sanctuary saved my unit when we were cut off near Kabul. 18 soldiers came home because you figured out how to get supplies to us when everyone else said it was impossible." One by one, each of the soldiers shared similar stories. Missions I had planned from behind a desk in Washington, strategic assessments I had written late at night, logistical solutions I had developed for problems I never fully understood. Each piece of paperwork, each late-night briefing, each classified report had apparently been part of something much larger than I had realized. I wasn't just a staff officer, I had been saving lives from thousands of miles away, using my mind as a weapon more powerful than any rifle. My family stood frozen during these testimonials, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock, confusion, and something that might have been the dawning realization of their own terrible mistake. My mother's hand was pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. David looked like he was seeing me for the first time in his life. But it was my father's reaction that struck me most. The man who had called my service playing soldier was staring at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not pride, he was too shocked for that, but recognition. The slow, dawning understanding that the daughter he had dismissed as a failure had actually become someone extraordinary. Hayes stepped forward again, his voice carrying across the now silent crowd. "General Thompson, it is my honor, on behalf of the United States Army and the soldiers whose lives you have saved through your service, to present you with these." He handed me a second folder, this one containing the official promotion orders, new identification cards, and a set of general's stars that gleamed like silver fire in the winter sunlight. "Ma'am," Hayes said, his voice formal but warm, "would you permit us to conduct a proper promotion ceremony?" I looked around at the crowd, at my family, at the soldiers who had come to honor someone they believed deserved recognition. For 23 years I had served in relative anonymity, believing my contributions were small, incremental, forgettable. I had been wrong about that too. "Yes," I said quietly, "I would be honored." And as the old guard began to form ceremonial ranks around me, I realized that this moment wasn't just about a promotion, it was about the vindication of every choice I had made, every sacrifice I had endured, every night I had gone to bed wondering if I mattered. It did matter. I had always mattered. They just hadn't been able to see it. The transformation that occurred over the next 30 minutes was unlike anything I had ever experienced. What began as a private family funeral became something else entirely, a spontaneous ceremony that drew spectators from blocks away as word spread through Richmond's interconnected social networks. Command Sergeant Major Hayes orchestrated the proceedings with the precision of someone who had conducted hundreds of military ceremonies. The 8 soldiers of the Old Guard formed a ceremonial square in front of St. Michael's Cathedral, their movements so synchronized they seemed to move as a single entity. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes announced to the growing crowd, his voice carrying the authority that comes from 3 decades of military service, "we are gathered here today to witness a historic moment. The promotion of Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Thompson to the rank of Brigadier General, United States Army." A murmur rippled through the audience. Some were family friends who remembered me as the rebellious teenager who had thrown her life away on military service. Others were strangers who had simply been drawn by the unusual spectacle. All of them were witnessing something they had never expected to see: the public recognition of achievements they never knew existed. The ceremony itself was both simple and profound. Hayes read the official promotion orders, his voice clear and unwavering as he recited the language that had been crafted in the highest levels of the Pentagon. The words spoke of exceptional service, strategic brilliance, and contributions to national security that extend far beyond traditional measures of military success. But it was what came next that truly stunned everyone present. A black sedan pulled up to the cathedral, and from it emerged a figure that made several people in the crowd gasp audibly. General Patricia Williams, Chief of Staff of the United States Army, the highest-ranking officer in the entire service, a woman whose face was recognizable to anyone who followed military affairs or national politics. She walked directly to me, her 4-star insignia catching the winter sunlight, her bearing reflecting the weight of command over 1 million soldiers worldwide. The crowd fell completely silent as she approached. "General Thompson," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the churchyard, "it is my distinct honor to personally pin on your new rank." My hands trembled as I stood at attention. This wasn't just a promotion, this was recognition at the highest possible level of military leadership. The Chief of Staff of the Army didn't travel to Richmond, Virginia, to promote lieutenant colonels. She came for officers whose contributions were so significant that they demanded personal acknowledgement. As General Williams pinned the silver star of a brigadier general onto my uniform, she spoke quietly, her words meant only for me, but somehow carrying to the hushed crowd around us. "The Joint Chiefs have been following your work for 3 years," she said. "The humanitarian operations you've planned have saved more civilian lives than any single officer in recent memory. The logistics systems you've developed have become the standard across all branches of service. You've done this while allowing others to take credit, while working in the shadows, while never seeking recognition." She stepped back and saluted me with crisp precision. "Today, that changes. Today, the Army publicly acknowledges what we have known privately for years. You are one of the finest strategic minds of your generation." The applause that followed was spontaneous and genuine. It started with the soldiers of the Old Guard, then spread to the crowd of onlookers, many of whom were still processing what they had witnessed. These weren't polite society claps. This was the kind of recognition that comes when people understand they are witnessing something genuinely historic. But it was my family's reaction that held my attention. My father stood at the edge of the crowd, the folder Hayes had given him still clutched in his white-knuckled grip. His face had gone through a series of transformations over the past hour, from irritation to confusion to shock to something that looked almost like grief. Not grief for the dead, but grief for the living. Grief for the 23 years he had spent believing his daughter was a failure when she was actually a hero. My mother sat heavily on the cathedral steps, her carefully composed facade completely abandoned. She stared at me with an expression I had never seen before, wonder mixed with regret, pride battling with shame. The woman who had spent decades perfecting the art of social appearances had just watched her embarrassing daughter receive recognition that would be front-page news in every military publication in the country. David stood between them, his successful lawyer's mind clearly struggling to reconcile the sister he thought he knew with the general he was seeing pinned with stars by the Chief of Staff of the Army. His wife Catherine whispered urgently in his ear, probably explaining the significance of what they were witnessing to someone who had never paid attention to military matters. But it was my nieces who affected me most. The 8-year-old twins stood wide-eyed, watching their newly discovered aunt receive honors they couldn't fully understand but clearly recognized as important. One of them tugged on David's coat and whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Daddy, why didn't you tell us Aunt Rebecca was a general?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. David had no answer because until 30 minutes ago, he hadn't known either. None of them had known. They had spent decades dismissing me as a failure, while remaining completely ignorant of who I actually was or what I had accomplished. General Williams concluded the ceremony with a brief speech about service, sacrifice, and the quiet heroes who protect freedom without seeking glory. She spoke about officers like me who worked behind the scenes, whose contributions might never make headlines, but whose impact could be measured in lives saved and missions accomplished. The promotion of General Thompson, she said, represents not just individual achievement, but the recognition of a new kind of military leadership. Leadership that prioritizes humanitarian outcomes alongside strategic objectives. Leadership that understands that true victory sometimes looks like refugees safely relocated, civilians evacuated from danger zones, and supply lines that deliver medicine instead of ammunition. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, I found myself standing alone in the space between my military family and my biological one. The soldiers of the old guard maintained their formation, ready to escort General Williams back to her vehicle. My family remained clustered near the cathedral, uncertain how to bridge the chasm that had just been revealed. It was my father who finally approached. He walked slowly, each step seeming to require tremendous effort. When he reached me, he stopped just beyond arm's length, as if afraid to come closer. "Rebecca," he said, and his voice was different than I had ever heard it, smaller, uncertain, stripped of the confidence that had always defined him. I don't know what to say." I looked at him, this man who had shaped so much of my early life through his rejection, who had driven me to prove myself in ways he never imagined, and felt something unexpected. Not anger, not triumph, but sadness. Sadness for all the years we had lost, all the conversations we had never had, all the pride he might have felt if he had just been willing to see. "You don't have to say anything," I replied quietly, "but you do have to live with it." The weight of those words settled between us, like a bridge that neither of us was quite ready to cross. The weeks that followed the cathedral ceremony unfolded like a slow-motion avalanche, reshaping everything in its path. The story of the Richmond general spread far beyond military circles, picked up by national news outlets, fascinated by the narrative of family rejection, transformed into public vindication. I tried to ignore the media attention, focusing instead on the overwhelming responsibilities of my new command. The Joint Task Force for Humanitarian Operations wasn't just a title, it was a massive undertaking that involved coordinating relief efforts across 3 continents, managing resources worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and overseeing operations that directly impacted the lives of civilians caught in conflict zones around the world. My new office at Fort Bragg was a testament to the scope of the work, walls covered with maps marking refugee camps, supply routes, and evacuation zones. Digital displays showed real-time data from operations in 12 different countries. The weight of command was unlike anything I had experienced, but it felt right in a way that surprised me. This was what I had been trained for without knowing it. Every strategy session at the Pentagon, every logistics puzzle I had solved, every late-night briefing I had attended, it had all been preparing me for this moment when I could use military precision to save lives rather than take them. But the personal aftermath was more complicated. The first letter arrived exactly 1 week after the ceremony. Expensive stationery, my mother's careful handwriting, my name written with the kind of precision that comes from years of social correspondence. I almost threw it away unopened, but something made me pause. "Rebecca," it began, with none of the warmth that should have existed between a mother and daughter, but also without the cold formality I had grown accustomed to. "I have spent the past week trying to find words that could somehow bridge the gap we created. I realize now that no words exist because no words can undo what we did." She went on to explain what had been in the folder Hayes had given my father: copies of classified commendations, mission reports with my name on them, documentation of operations that had saved thousands of lives. The army had declassified just enough information to show my family exactly who their failed daughter had become. We received a call from Senator Mitchell's office, the letter continued. Apparently, his daughter Catherine had mentioned the ceremony to him, and he wanted to personally thank us for raising a daughter who exemplified American military values. He seemed confused when we explained that we hadn't spoken to you in over 2 decades. The irony wasn't lost on me. My brother's father-in-law, a man with real political power, now knew more about my military service than my own parents had ever bothered to learn. The letter concluded with something that might have been an apology, though it was couched in the kind of language that avoided taking full responsibility. We realize now that we may have misunderstood your choices. Perhaps there are things we should have known, should have asked, should have supported. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my desk drawer, next to the promotion orders that had changed everything. I wasn't ready to forgive, but I was no longer angry. Anger required too much energy, and I had more important things to focus on. The second letter came from David. It was shorter, more direct, written in the straightforward prose of someone trained in legal communication. He wanted to meet. His daughters, he wrote, had been asking questions about their general aunt ever since the ceremony. They wanted to know why they had never met me, why I wasn't at family gatherings, why no one had ever mentioned that they had a relative who was a hero. I don't have good answers for them, he admitted, because I don't have good answers for myself. 3 months later, I agreed to meet him for coffee in a neutral location, a small cafe near Fort Bragg, far from the social pressures of Richmond. He arrived precisely on time, a habit we had both inherited from our father, and sat across from me with the careful posture of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. "You look different," he said finally, after we had ordered our drinks and exhausted the safe topics of weather and traffic. "I am different." He nodded slowly, studying my face as if seeing me for the first time. "The girls want to meet you. Catherine thinks it would be good for them to have a role model who chose something meaningful." The phrase hung between us, laden with implications about choices and meaning, and the paths we take through life. "What do you want, David?" I asked directly. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. "I want to understand how we got it so wrong. How we could live in the same family, share the same last name, and know so little about who you really were. You never asked. You never told us. You never gave me a reason to think you'd want to know." We sat in silence, 2 middle-aged siblings, trying to navigate the wreckage of a relationship that had never really existed. Finally, David spoke again. "I've been thinking about my grandmother's funeral, about what you said when you walked away." I remembered. "I didn't walk away when I was 18. I was pushed." "You were right," he said quietly. "We pushed you away, and then we blamed you for being gone." It wasn't a complete apology, but it was acknowledgement. And sometimes acknowledgement is the first step toward something resembling repair. 6 months after that conversation, I attended my first family gathering in 24 years. It was my niece's 9th birthday party, held in David's backyard, with balloons and cake, and the chaotic energy that comes with children and sugar. I wore civilian clothes, jeans and a simple sweater, but the girls insisted I show them my dress uniform, which I had brought at their request. They tried on my hat, examined my ribbons, and asked 1,000 questions about what it was like to be a general. Their curiosity was genuine, unmarked by the prejudices and assumptions that had poisoned previous generations of family relationships. "Do you get to tell people what to do?" one of them asked. "I get to help people," I replied. "Sometimes that means making decisions, but mostly it means figuring out how to solve problems that help keep people safe." My parents were there too, sitting at the edge of the gathering like guests at their own family party. They watched me interact with their granddaughters, with expressions I couldn't quite read, pride mixed with regret, joy shadowed by loss. We exchanged polite conversation, the kind of careful pleasantries that people use when they're not sure how to talk to each other. It wasn't reconciliation, not exactly. Too much had been broken for too long, but it was a beginning, a recognition that family can be rebuilt, even if it can never be restored to what it might have been. As I drove back to Fort Bragg that evening, I thought about the trajectory of my life, how rejection had led to service, how service had led to purpose, how purpose had ultimately led back to a kind of peace. I hadn't needed their approval to become who I was meant to be, but having it, finally, Felt like setting down a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. My phone buzzed with a text message from one of my nieces. "Thank you for coming, Aunt Rebecca. Can you teach me to be strong like you?" I smiled and typed back, "You're already strong, I can teach you how to use it." The road ahead stretched out under the North Carolina stars, leading toward a future I was finally free to shape on my own terms. I had spent so many years trying to prove I was worthy of love that I had forgotten the most important lesson of all. The only approval that truly matters is the one you give yourself, and I was finally ready to give it. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now, and hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.